United States began to prepare for war in Iraq in 2002, the Department of State commissioned an historian, Drew Erdman, who had studied under Ernest May, who is, as you know, is a proponent of using history for policy studies. And they wanted him to write a report on 20th century post-war reconstructions. He did. He wrote a report and he concluded that over the course of the 20th century, the things that were needed for long-term success depended on, one, international support from the outset, and two, sufficient number of troops on the ground to enable stability in the post-war phase. His report impressed Secretary of State Colin Powell, who sent copies around personally to the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Vice President. Later on, someone asked Erdman why it was that his report, which seemed to be so accurate, seemed to have so little influence on the policymakers, and he suggested maybe it was because it wasn't read. So in other words, you can't write them, but you don't necessarily know whether or not it's going to impact on the policy. I mentioned media a little bit. The media is a huge consumer of what we historians do. In fact, I think when the Center for Historical Office got started, we thought that you historians would be our primary people, our constituency. You would be calling us up and saying, you know, we need information about such and such. But the fact of the matter is, just at that point, the historical profession was shifting from political to social history, and the phone didn't ring that often from historians. But it began to ring from newspaper reporters and broadcasters who were on deadline, who needed to get a little bit of information, and who, many of whom had managed to go through 4 years of college without apparently ever taking a history course or a political science course. This was, to me, epitomized by the telephone call I received during President Clinton's impeachment trial from a reporter from a reputable institution who said, "Who was Andrew Johnson and why was he impeached?" And so you do want to get into the History 101 lessons over the phone along the way. We are a nonpartisan office, and we provide as straight factual information as possible. We let everybody else put the spin on it. But we've developed a fairly good reputation. Recently I got an email from a reporter for the New York Times who thanked me for some information and said, "The Senate Historian's Office is seen as a treasure in Washington, and I can see why." There's a lot of things that I'm going to sort of quickly summarize because time is short here, but the federal historians, as you've heard about the National Archives, there is a relationship between historians and the National Archives, particularly among those who work as historians in federal agencies, because we often consult with our agencies and with the National Archives on transferring records to the National Archives. I have to tell you the latest thing we found when a senator left office at the beginning of this Congress, not voluntarily, voters sent him away, but they moved some bookcases in his office, and behind his bookcase they found a petition from women in California asking for suffrage. It was dated 1910. It was quite interesting. It's been, obviously no one's moved that bookcase in quite some time. It's also interesting to see, obviously, whoever occupied that office must have just sort of tossed the petition up in the air. But in any case, but we never can tell what we're going to find, because most of the documents we deal with are a little more recent than that. But we are also involved very much, federal historians, in consulting on Freedom of Information Act requests and doing all sorts of assistance in terms of declassification of materials. And there's ways in which we can assist. Another major part of what federal historians do is oral history. I run an oral history project, but there are oral history projects in agencies throughout the federal government. They have been doing oral history for a very long time, at least since the 1890s, actually, some of the first interviews commissioned by the federal government. There were historians at Normandy Beach doing interviews during World War II. There are historians today interviewing just about every possible activity the federal government is involved in, and they're not just doing their own, they're also collecting interviews. The Veterans Project at the Library of Congress now has collected something like more like 45,000 interviews. It's also been sort of training civilians, citizens, on how to do interviews to submit them to the project.